So, and do you mind just kicking off one more time with your intro for the
Sure.
recording? Thank you.
Sorry for those of you in live that get to hear my spiel again. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Ann Welsh. So I'm a clinical psychologist, I'm an executive coach, and I work with ambitious women around leadership, career growth, modern life, parenting, working motherhood. And about 15 years ago, I left my own role at Harvard University to build my own practice. And the bulk of that practice focuses on helping women pursue ambition in spite of some of the realities of the systems that weren't designed for us. I also work with organizations to better support their working parents in particular. And I'm really, really excited to be here today. I'm looking forward to talking about how all the system stuff that we're going to address show up in our own lives, but also talk a little bit about how we can make some changes, even personally, to navigate those complicated and frustrating systems around us.
Amazing. Thank you. Stacy, we'll pass it over to you.
Sure. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I am Stacy Messier. I'm the general manager for CIC New England. We specialize in innovation campuses, life science labs, as well as catalyzing innovation ecosystems. As you can imagine, right, I sort of sit at the intersection between innovation, placemaking and real estate, as well as sort of like the community engagement practices. Before CIC, I spent a long time in the tech industry and made a pivot myself, also not due to a lack of ambition, but an incredible amount of ambition to say, like, how do I increase the things that I want to do, but then also how do I get the opportunity to run a true P&L that's beyond just a user experience team. So very
Mm.
excited to be here and be on this panel. Thank you, Allison, for organizing.
Yes. Thanks for being here. Nicole.
Hi, everyone. Good morning from California. I'm Nicole. I'm the founder of Her Era. It's based on my maiden name, Herrera. My background is in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now I own my own company where I do consulting on DE&I, and I also have a career coaching practice focused on women and working moms. So prior to starting my company, I was previously with Google for almost 14 years, leading DE&I for one of their engineering organizations. You can imagine I have a strong passion and solid experience working in the tech industry and trying to drive the exact systemic change that we're going to be talking a lot about today. And I am also one of the women whose personal story and experience shows the cost of systems that don't support working moms. I unfortunately lost my job while I was on maternity leave with my first baby, which is what really inspired me to be working in this space directly with working moms to support them in what can be one of the most vulnerable times, where, again, as we'll be talking about, our ambition is not going away. If anything, we have twice 10x, the amount of
Yeah, don't do
ambition
that.
as others, and we deserve all the support. So excited to be here in community with you all today and have this really important and timely conversation. Thank you, Allison.
Nicole and Felicia.
Yes. Hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Awesome. Well, nice to meet everybody. Happy Monday. It's springtime here in Boston, which we're very excited about coming out of the winter. It's been a long winter. My background is I was a VP of product for 20 years in tech startups. My PhD research is focused on transformational leadership of women. So I spent about 8 years studying women entrepreneurs, women leaders around the globe in first world countries, third world countries, and just really understanding what they need to sustainably thrive. And that work has all kind of culminated to the work I do now, which really sits at the intersection of AI literacy, workforce transformation, and leadership development. And so I'm founder of AI Powered Women. It's an MIT anchored leadership platform focused on the human side of AI adoption. So we look at human centered AI leadership, responsible AI adoption. Our academy has about 39% of the women are entrepreneurs, about 40% are executives, and the remaining are students and researchers. It's a super fast growing community, and our conference is this September at MIT. And Yeah, so we're really kind of growing the whole idea around human-centered AI leadership and how we're reimagining leadership in the next era and how women are a part of that. And I guess a little personal story about me. I left my corporate job in 2023 after being laid off shortly after coming back from maternity leave and almost dying in childbirth and recovering from that. I had a near-death experience, was in a wheelchair for a long time, and had a lot of health issues that year. And after kind of coming back and not getting really any support, and quite the opposite, getting increased pressure because that was the year, as many of you know, AI took off with ChatGPT and everything, so the pressure increased. And so I was really playing in that space of AI and machine learning and all of that, but I also saw not only how cruel these systems can be towards women and mothers especially, but that it just isn't working. And that the leadership that we've had the past century, especially in the workplace, is outdated and it needs to change. And I do believe deeply that the research, the trends, and everything that's happening the past 24 months has been positioning women to actually uniquely contribute to the next era of leadership. And I'm happy to contribute more in the conversation about that.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for being here. So as you can see, today's conversation is going to be meaty. We're going to really try to move beyond the narrative, which we know is false. And instead of asking, are women not ambitious enough? Should we be asking for more? We want to ask, what forms of ambition are actually being overlooked? Where are the structural constraints actually shaping the outcomes? And what does real progress look like? So our goal for today is absolutely awareness, but it's also about action. So we're going to have some time at the end to talk about some actionable takeaways. But we want this to be informative. And so if you have questions that pop up along the way, please put them in the chat. We also have some time carved out at the end for some live Q&A. All right, so with that, let's dive in. I want to start with the role that this media narrative, this landscape, these continued headlines over the last few months play in shaping how we understand women's progress at work. So, Anne, I'd love to kick it off with you. How did these narratives, women ruin the workplace, the ambition gap, how are these actually influencing decisions inside the workplace around promotions, performance reviews, and the decisions that women are making about participation in paid work overall?
Yeah, so the problem with the framing ambition gap, right, is twofold. One is it makes the story really small, right? It makes it this one version of reality and it ignores the support gap and all of the other problems that, you've already spoken to that we'll get into it. But the other problem is that it becomes a cognitive filter. So essentially, we as humans, our brains are kind of lazy and they like to find evidence for what they already believe. We'll say that, right? As humans, we really rely on something called cognitive schemas, which are like mental frameworks that help our brains process information quickly. And so once we have a schema, once that narrative takes hold, like the idea that women are less ambitious, that becomes the lens through which we interpret all behavior. Right. So we see a woman pull back for some reason, and we don't look for the reason. We just say, oh, it's because she's not ambitious. Or we see in our company, oh, there's no women in leadership. Well, it's because women are less ambitious. Right. The problem is the same action then can be read really differently. Right. A man declining a project is a strategic move. A woman declining a project is lacking ambition. And once those interpretations start to show up in performance reviews, in promotion conversations, their narrative becomes really self-reinforcing. And we end up with this cycle of women being forced out and then having that dismissed by companies as them leaving by choice. And companies saying like, yeah, that's why we have no women in leadership roles. It's not an us problem, it's women, right? So it essentially robs the narrative of any nuance, robs women of any autonomy, and it makes it all women's individual fault rather than accepting any sort of systemic or workplace issue, which again, in the end, then that means they have no responsibility to fix it. It's fairly convenient, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, Nicole, I'd love your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, just definitely doubling down and echoing everything that Anne shared. The biggest issue with these headlines is they're placing the blame on women and actually perpetuating systemic inequity instead of actually looking and questioning the systems within the workplace, to understand why women are not advancing. And so, when we think about working moms, the message becomes the, years old trope of you have to mother as if you don't work and you have to work as if you are not a mother. But the bias is already so deep that the act of becoming a mom, already creates this perception that you are less ambitious by default. The motherhood penalty is very real and alive, which I think is something that for me personally, and I think a lot of younger women, we felt very blindsided by that. We grew up in this system that told us you could have it all, and women have broken these glass ceilings. And so, the real issue is that these headlines are perpetuating this blame on women, reinforcing bias and shifting attention away from the systems that were never designed equitably in the first place. And that shows up in really concrete ways inside of organizations, in performance reviews, promotion decisions. Women are being evaluated not just on their impact and their results, but on how they are being perceived, to their peers, to their managers. Am I ambitious enough? Am I grateful enough for this opportunity despite the cost that it's having? Am I leaning in enough? And so the bar becomes almost impossible. You have to perform exceptionally at your job while also managing how your ambition is being perceived and interpreted. And too ambitious, then you're going to be seen as aggressive, and not ambitious enough, then you're seen as lacking drive. And it really creates this double standard that many women, and especially working moms, are navigating every single day. And instead of asking, where did the ambition go for women, we should be asking things like, are the promotion criteria clear and fair? Are caregiving realities accounted for, in how careers progress, and all of these things? And again, focusing on the system and the policies and the programs that are in place and what changes need to be made.
Allison, can I
Absolutely.
jump in with one more thought? Because Nicole said something
Absolutely.
that triggered just another outcome that we sometimes don't think about, and it's on how we think about ourselves as women, right? And so often, like I think Nicole was talking about the ways that companies don't see it, but so often I work with clients who think that they are the problem, right? That we the fancy term internalized misogyny, but really like we've internalized this systemic stuff as our problem. And then it feels like, well, I can't fix it, so there's must be something wrong with me. And then I back off of those opportunities, right? Like I don't go for them because, there's that data that, men will apply for a job when they have like one of the requirements, and women need 100 to actually feel like they can even ask for the job. So I don't want to forget to mention that there's like a pretty massive impact on our sense of self and our sense of confidence. And that ends up being cumulative over time too.
It's a really great point. I think that one of the things in my work, thinking a lot about transformation inside of workplaces to alleviate burnout, to help with well-being, but also just enable all professionals to, work in a space where they're more holistically well. I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about the load both inside the workplace and at home. And what's really interesting in this period of transformation is there's a lot of questioning of abilities. There's a lot of folks, and to your point around it's compounding, and I've already felt a little inadequate, and now I'm trying to rapidly upskill and keep up with this trend of how AI is transforming so rapidly. And Felicia talks about in her work how a lot of the glue that's kind of holding that all together to help teams get through this period of transformation is being held together by women. So I'd love to dig into that just on the heels of that last point. Felicia, the invisible labor at work, can you talk us through like what's happening, what's historically happened, but most acutely happening right now inside of workplaces?
Yeah, so going back to kind of what everyone's saying here with the ambition gap, right? It's not only inaccurate, it's also dangerous, right? It tells women to optimize harder and ask better, lean in more, and brand themselves better, when the deeper issue is really that many of the workplaces are still not designed to convert women's effort into authority and advancement and long-term power. A lot of this, it's funny, and the more we get deeper into this work and the research, it really is actually less about workplace dynamics and more about power dynamics. And power is a very interesting piece of all of this, especially as we go into the next century with AI. And the data backs that up. I mean, McKinsey's Women in the Workplace, it was a 2025 report. It found a gap in women's stated desire for promotion, but it also found that when women receive the same level of career support as men, that gap disappears. So that's a huge clue. And what gets labeled as lower ambition often looks more like, weaker sponsorship and fewer conditions for women for the ambition to feel like worth the cost. And now when you layer AI on top of all of that, we're asking women to really navigate one of the biggest workplace shifts in human history at the exact moment many of them are already carrying a disproportionate load, right? So there was research that found that 71% of leaders say their workforce is not ready to successfully leverage AI, and only about a third say their workforce is ready. So it's not just a technology issue, it's really a human readiness issue and a trust issue and a workplace design issue. And if women may have more to lose if we, they have a lot more to lose if we get this wrong, right? Like that trajectory is growing. And what we're seeing is we're actually going back, and all the work that we've done with women's leadership and empowerment and all of that is being undone with AI. And a UN study, I believe it reported around 27% of women's employment is potentially exposed to generative AI compared to just 20% of men's, and that gap is growing. So we're seeing that in some cases, depending on the industry, it's up to 3 to 5 times that of men's in terms of being completely displaced by AI. And so we've also found that in high-income countries, women's jobs fall into the highest automation risk category compared with only like 3% of men. And so when we talk about AI reshaping work, women are more exposed to the disruption while often having less influence over how the transition is being designed. So there's really kind of this whole broader social layer where women, still carry a disproportionate share of the unpaid care work globally, about 2.5 times that as much of men on average. So when organizations say, why aren't women moving faster into AI, or why aren't they more ambitious, or why aren't they upskilling faster, why aren't they adopting it faster? Well, they're being replaced because they're just not keeping up. I think we have to be honest that many women are already operating at full load. I mean, the issue is not that they lack ambition. The issue is that the system keeps demanding adaptation and is speeding up now with AI without offering enough support and training and, structural power in return.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important. And I think the care infrastructure piece is really, I'm just on the heels of that and all of the stats, but really just how the gap is widening. And yet we've got this disproportionate share outside of work that is not becoming more balanced. I think, Anne, you mentioned, I saw something in the promotion of this event about really recategorizing it as a structure gap, a support gap, excuse me, right? And so I'd love to just dig into that point and get your perspective on why we're still treating it like a personal issue, right? Why do we think about care being something that has to be kind of solved for, and it's very individualistic and you've got to go figure it out and then kind of come back to work and put your professional hat on? Like, why is that still happening?
Yeah, well, and I think, that why did I labeled it the support gap immediately for the exact point that Felicia made, right? When you control for the support, the gap goes away. So it's a mediating variable. We're interpreting the data wrong. It's kind of a basic mistake from a research perspective. I'm not quite sure why it got framed that way in the McKinsey report. It was kind of shocking, again, from my data hat. But in terms of why, it's convenient. Right. I could go on for hours about kind of how we undervalue care work and underpay it, and all gendered fields see this. Certainly it shows up in the world of therapy. But I think that the fundamental why is humans are inertial. We do what we've been doing and we don't necessarily like to question it. And I think in this case, that the status quo gets maintained when we see it as a personal issue rather than a design problem, right? If caregiving is framed as personal, the solution is individual resilience. Women just need to step up. If we see it as structural, then leaders have to rethink schedules, advancement pathways, support system. That one story preserves the status quo, the other requires change. And I think we get a lot of pushback when we start to talk about caregiving as infrastructure, which is, I think, the model that we actually need to take here, right? If nobody who has children can go to work, then we don't have doctors. We do not have teachers. We do not have people doing their jobs. Just like if there's 3 feet of snow on the ground, we can't get to work, right? So when we start to see it as an infrastructure problem, then it becomes like a public good, but people don't want to pay for that, right? Whether we're talking about taxes or companies or whatever. So I think there's a lot of people that would have to change and be inconvenienced, and they don't want it, right? So it's easier to just say, oh, let's just keep putting this on moms over and over and over again.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a bit more now about transformation, like where do we go from here? But it's really an important point. It's very complex. It is not easy. None of what we're talking about today is an easy solve. It does require redesigning and kind of rethinking, retooling, being flexible to think about alternative ways that everyone can participate. And so, Stacey, I'd love, before we kind of talk about next steps change, I'd love to kind of ground in some of what you've seen in terms of tools, technologies, decision making. So fascinating your experience kind of taking that UX lens on end-to-end experience, both externally but internally inside of workplaces. And so I'd love to just get your take. Like, what have you seen? What's holding us back? How are some of those kind of design thinking questions and biases potentially maybe still holding us back, before we think about what comes next?
I'm so glad you asked. And thank you so much for your notes about the research and how the data is also presented, because from any categorical research lens, right? Like it is all about the way that we tell the story based on the data. And we are in a media landscape right now that is completely transforming the framing. And there's probably, I don't know, I'm gonna be as polite and professional as I can. There is a lot of permission in the wrong direction in terms of the ways at which we want to sort of create clickbait around these headlines when it is super complex. So I just want to acknowledge that. Another vector, before we start talking about like places and ways that we can support women in the workplace and what I've seen, there's 2 vectors that I was writing down very quickly as you all were chatting. One is the job market right now feels like entrapment. The job market is really, really tough in terms of your ability to make a change for yourself the moment that you feel like you are in a workplace that doesn't support you. That is adding another layer onto this complexity onion that is making things really, really difficult for women at large. And for anyone on this call who has reached that peak moment of burnout, it is really difficult to see the forest through the trees and know what you actually do and don't have permission to change. And I say that particularly because we are constantly mitigating risk. And so the risk right now with a really tight job market means that it feels even more risky to be a new mom that's returning from work, to be a person who is burned out in their current role and you want to make a change. All of those conversations feel like they are 3, 4x the weight that they used to be. And that is another vector that I just felt like we need to place it on the table today to acknowledge where we are, particularly in the US. So all that to say, from a user experience lens, essentially, when you understand how to step way back and look at the journey that any one employee might go through, but also how are those systems both supporting and not supporting them. Some of the things that has been surprising is really the inconvenient truth of sitting down and having a conversation with the person and making space to ask those questions. And as simple as it sounds, I had 3 moms all go out on maternity leave last year within 2 weeks of one another, like nonstop succession. And it was an incredible moment in time for both the company to say, thank goodness all of the mothers who came before these women had set up protocols and experiences to make sure that it was as easy as possible, but it still was really challenging to comb through the FMLA and the legalities and how do you get the right amount of support and you calculate your time off in order to just know that you can go out on maternity leave and focus on your family.
Mhm.
In the comeback, though, making space to have those earnest conversations about how much of the ground do you want to hit running versus how much do you want to just find a moment of stability, but also I'm not going to assume what those definitions are. In design thinking and in UX, right? Our assumptions are a place to start, but they are never the true answer. So making sure that you take that lens of curiosity and sitting down with your direct reports, your peers, whomever it might be, to then actually shed light on what do you want to do right now? What does the first 2 months do you think looks like when you come back to work? I had one person that was like, I still need to figure out how to pick the time that I should come back to work, and it's probably not going to be 9 a.m. Is that okay? Absolutely. How do we make those changes? And then also just check in with one another to make sure you feel like you're getting what you need out of this moment in transition. On the flip side, we had two incredible promotion opportunities, and there was no one in leadership saying, "Ooh, let's hold back on that." It was very much an active discussion, both with the person that was up for it, but as well as within the workplace to acknowledge like this is where we are, but also the business has value and has need for these things. These are the right people. We should have this conversation right now.
Fantastic. Oh my gosh, so much there to dig into. But I really appreciate that you brought up the underpinning of the risk, how it just feels so much more vulnerable right now, kind of than ever, to
Yeah,
be able to raise concern about where, particularly as women, if you are at the intersection of a rapidly expanding and changing workplace and have tons of caregiving responsibility, both children and maybe, you know, parents that are
family.
aging or
Yeah,
neighbors that you're looking after, that right now feels too heavy to say, I'm not sure, to put a boundary in place or to raise it with a manager, to your point, given the climate we're in. And so there are also things that potentially aren't being named and we're doing, and we are continuing to just want to do our very best to show up, and there's this kind of thematic, my work will speak for itself. And so those two things combined, Nicole, I'd love to get your perspective on what types of things are continuing to be invisible, what types of, ambition from a both support of the team, continuation of a role, as moms coming back who are leaning in, but maybe leaning in silently, and not to use lean in. I just, or kind of like, I'm going to do my job to the best of my ability. And I'm not going to speak too loudly because I don't want to sort of have anything be too risky. Like, what are we not seeing? What types of things are continuing to be invisible?
Yes. I think we already started this conversation around the fact that ambition isn't just one thing, there isn't just one lane. And along that same line, leadership, there isn't just one form of leadership, but how systems and performance is rewarded within the traditional workplace does the leadership as just kind of like this one way of leading, which we're all living out in real time, how outdated that is and how tired women are of operating within those systems that only rewards one type of leadership that's clearly not benefiting like a large majority of the actual workforce. And so we really need to redefine how leadership and performance is assessed within the workplace. But some examples of, how women are consistently being undervalued or performing invisible work. We've talked a little bit about just like emotional and relational work. Women are often the ones who are mentoring new hires. We're supporting our struggling teammates. We're helping onboard. We're holding the emotional temperature of a team. This is the work that keeps organizations functioning, that keeps the lights on, but it's extremely rare that it shows up in a performance review or it's part of how we're being evaluated within promotion criteria. We're doing all of that glue work that's project management and keeping things moving. Also holding the culture of a team, with all of these pullbacks on DE&I that are happening. Women have already been doing that invisible work for many years, but now when you divest from the actual talent and teams that were supposed to be doing that work, it flips back onto women and underrepresented groups to keep pushing all of that work forward. And so we're really seeing this resurgence of employee resource groups, for example, as a way to drive that work forward. But people are doing that work on top of their day jobs. So, in my work, I'm seeing a huge increase in caregiver groups popping up as an employee resource group within companies that didn't have those before. But if we're already dealing with all of these things that we're talking about and holding so much as working moms, it's like, why should we have to lead the change and advocate for ourselves for everything that needs to happen within the workplace? And so that can be very heavy. And then when we talk about working moms, there is so much invisible work. Anyone that's a mom knows that. We're managing complex logistics, time constraints, schedules, and enormous responsibility outside of work. I mean, how many of us have dealt with a screaming baby, toddler, or even a teenager, in the morning and then juggled a million logistics, but somehow managed to pull it together and be 100% on point for our 9 to 5 job? That is not a lack of ambition. That is elite level leadership and skills that are just, again, not being rewarded within the workplace. And so I think there's a real opportunity for organizations to expand how we define ambition and leadership so that we can start valuing those skill sets better in the workplace. And then when it comes to some of that invisible labor, there needs to be more accountability in the workplace to account for that. Even when it comes still to just breastfeeding, pumping, and all of those accommodations, those are also still treated often as an individual problem for a working mom to navigate. There are so many workplaces that still are not up to policy on what needs to be changing and shifting within their physical workplace just to allow moms to do that bodily function that is literally sustaining life. So again, just so much opportunity for deeper change and support.
Thank you. Yeah, I think to your point, so much happens sometimes even before the workday starts, and it's I would argue even more ambition to want to dig in and hold both sides of home work and bring your best self, as you said, that elite level that elite level performance. I would love to see that more in terms of how we're shaping performance reviews, because I think it's very true. And I think, as we think about hiring, we talked a little bit about promotions, about performance tools, and we're really trying to embed some of these changes into how we look at flexible options, how we think about what does the work day need to be. And it can't be 24 hours. It can't be we're always on because, you have a hybrid role or a remote role. That just means you're available for everything around the clock. How do we start to think about and shape leadership decisions to actually incorporate some of these changes and sort of make way for different types of work participation? And as I mentioned, more flexibility overall. So Felicia, I'd love to start from your perspective with how do we think differently in this moment in time? I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome.
Got you.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say about that. I guess I'll start with, and this is something honestly that's been part of my own learning journey, because I spent like 8 years studying women and leadership and entrepreneurs and did that in my PhD. And then I saw it as being an only woman on a lot of, male dominated teams. And I've been trying to kind of figure this out over the years. And it's like, I've been part of so many of these panels and conversations and leading conferences. And it keeps coming back to like, okay, cool. Women are great at getting together and talking about this stuff and identifying the problems, but like, what do we actually do to change it? And so my answer to that question for a long time was like, you get them in a room, you get them in a community, you get them to a conference, you get them empowered. And that is part of the answer. But I think the more challenging truth that I'm still kind of coming fully to grips with, to be honest, is that we can't do it without men. I'm going to say it. And so, and this is a big piece that I think it does go back to male allies, but it also goes back to just, you've got to like step back and look at where the power in the world is right now. Like, creating these groups for women, and this is what we do at the AI Powered Women Conference and our academy and all that. We're trying to get women to feel psychologically safe because they don't feel psychologically safe in a lot of their workplaces. So we want them to feel psychologically safe so they can learn AI, be economically empowered, and create these alliances with women, which is great. But that's really, that psychological safety is just the beginning. Safety alone doesn't change the system. So, when you step back and look at the power dynamics, 85 to 90% of venture capital partners are men. About 98% of venture capital goes to male founders. So you've got 2%, like you said, that are going to women founders. Roughly 7 to 80% of the senior AI technical leadership roles are held by men. So that alone, right? Like when you think about power dynamics, AI leadership, where we're going in the coming decade, the capital allocation and the AI deployment decisions are remaining male dominated. So it's not about blame. It's not about man hating. It's not about bashing, even the system too much. It's about really changing the systems and the structures through coalition. And the future of AI, it's not going to be shaped by women just being empowered alone in those rooms. It's really going to be looking at, how diverse teams make better decisions and detect risk earlier, and mixed leadership strengthens long-term resilience and trust. And when power broadens, the performance improves. So I always say, like, men in the room, I don't know if there's anybody on this call that's a man or an ally. But the next time you decide where to invest or who to hire or what to automate, or you're thinking about kind of some of the dynamics on your teams, I always ask them to like slow down, pause, self-reflect, and really ask the question, does this room echo me or expand me? Because AI will scale the worldview of the people guiding it. And AI is one of the biggest threats and also opportunities that we have right now in the workplace. And the blind spots, don't stay small once they're coded into the system. So we need women being part of these conversations, part of these decisions, being part of AI, building it, creating it, innovating with it. It's also really great for moms and women and, all different life stages, because AI does help free up that time and step more deeply into our humanity if we're using it right. And so I think it's really enlisting the help of the people in power, which unfortunately are still primarily men. So I think if we want this needle to move, I'm going to say two things. One, it's going to be research and data. And this is why we're partnering deeply with research institutions that are like creating this research, because that then feeds back into the narratives that the people in power are going to be trickling down through these decisions, policy and workplaces and, HR policy, all of these things, right, come from data. So whoever's leading the data and leading the research has a lot of power to shape that. Two is making sure that men are educated on this, educated on women's experiences, educated, yes, on the data too, but also just on the qualitative parts of all of this experience of like where women are at, why these conversations are so messy and complex, how their daughters are struggling, how their wives are struggling, how their mothers are struggling, how their friends are struggling. There needs to be more empathy and compassion. This is a shared human experience. This is not men versus women. We all raise children. We all want the next generation to thrive. This is an innately human experience to want the next generation of children to do well and not be hurt and not be having a third of kids going out in the world and thinking about suicide constantly and having mental health issues. Like, there is a lot of pain in our world right now, and we have to find a better way to raise the next generation, because even if we can't change it immediately for ourselves, we have to think about the next generation ahead. And moms do that best, but dads do too. Dads care. So like we need, and I know not everybody here is parents, so I don't want to keep centering it around children, but this is a next generation challenge as well of how we're really shaping the world ahead of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the data piece, which is so important. As per usual, this has flown by, so we're going to have time for just one last question. But I think the data piece is so important, right? Like, how are we actually tracking? What does success look like? And what are we looking for as those markers? So, Nicole, I'd love to start with you. Maybe we'll do a round robin and hear from everyone on this one, but I'd love to hear, like, what will signal success? What are some of the things that we should be tracking that will help us understand if we're making progress?
Yes. Hmm. Well, first off, I want to say a lot of this data exists and has existed. We're in an incredibly challenging environment right now, given the national narrative around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the large divestment that we're seeing in that space. And so a lot of companies have this data, the restrictions around that data, and the action they're willing to take about that data is what is seeing huge, pushback and rollback right now. But metrics that would really actually signal real progress for women, obviously we think about representation as the starting point. We're striving for equitable representation. That means women are at parity with their male counterparts at every level and function across the company, not just in certain roles, but really at every level and function. And then we think about equitable outcomes once they're inside the company. So promotion equity, are women being promoted at the same rates across levels and functions? Pay equity is still something that we know does not exist. And when we think about the intersectional lens as well, which I know we're not going to have a ton of time to dive into today, that only compounds for women of color. Retention rates, are you retaining women at the same rates? We obviously know with the large workforce changes that are happening that is not the case. Women are not being retained at the same rates as their male counterparts. And then lastly, belonging and experience as well. It's a pivotal piece to everything that I just talked about, right? It's not enough to just hire women and make sure that they're being paid and promoted equitably, but are they having, a positive experience once they're in the company? And people experience belonging not because they're told they belong over and over and over again, but because the system consistently shows them that they matter. And that is the biggest missing component that I see in my work in diversity, equity, and inclusion is, that performative of label and poster that you're going to see in every room. Women belong here. Women belong here. We care about women. That's not what makes women feel they belong. The system needs to consistently show them through representation, promotion, pay equity, and all of these things. And so we know that the focus on these metrics needs to come back within companies. Behavioral change and allyship and all of these things, they don't happen on their own. We know that. That's why systemic change takes years. We can't expect those things to just magically happen and people's awareness to just appear overnight. And so if we want to see this focus come back around these metrics, we're going to need to see companies reinvest in these really critical areas for the improvement of their organizational health overall. And that's what I tell people too, is this isn't a diversity problem. This isn't a women problem. This is a strategic workforce plan that you need to have in place to face the reality of, the future of workforce planning. So
Absolutely. And I love the distinction between performative versus true, actionable. We're tracking the data and it's cultivating and lived experience of everybody in the workplace. So thank you for making all of those points. And what would signal progress from your perspective?
I think Nicole just hit all of the big things, but I think for me, it's really about the not just box checking. I see so many companies that want to roll out another app to solve the problem. And, as Felicia has already said, like, right, we're scaling bias by using technology blindly. And so we really need to see not only the quantitative data, but the qualitative data as well, right? Because I think there's a lot of hiding that can happen in numbers that doesn't happen when we actually talk to people about their experiences. And there's real systemic and objective ways to do qualitative research, right? So we can do that. We can get that data. I think we just really undervalue it. We want it to be quick and easy rather than nuanced and complicated and therefore human. And so I'd want to see that data really showing that women are feeling supported and experiencing that support. And I think it's going to be not just within one workplace, right? It's going to have to be really, yes, we can start there, but it's going to have to be broad. I think so often we want data to be the thing that changes people's minds. It doesn't always, right? We already have, like Nicole said, we have the data. So I think we need more of the stories and people able to hear that. And I think it's a far more complicated question, unfortunately, than maybe we can solve in this panel.
Absolutely. And thank you for naming. I mean, this is all complex. No, we're not here to say this is easy and we'll have it all wrapped up and done by the end of the quarter, or which is actually rapidly approaching. But yeah, this is hard. But I think the reality is even more so, that's why it requires our time, our attention. We need kind of shared participation and wrapping our arms around the problems instead of the simple, oh, well, this is not our problem. Go figure it out on your own. So thank you for naming that. Stacy, what would progress look like for you?
I want to connect a few things that people have said so far, like a little constellation. Nicole, maybe it was you that mentioned when we're decreasing, where we see like HR teams in particular being cut as a cost measure from the corporate perspective. That is one area where women, by and large, end up soaking up a lot of those, people business partner sort of responsibilities inherently. And so I would love to see a connection between when a business is making those kinds of changes, because it is necessary, because of where we are in time. How are you approaching change management to sit down with your female leaders, employees, etc., to ask the hard question of where is this work actually going to fall? What is the fallout that's going to happen and distribute itself invisibly, mostly, to people? And who are going to be the ones that are going to pick it up, and how are we going to support them? Well, in what ways is the existing system either helping or hurting them? I had an unbelievable opportunity about a year and a half ago to sit down with an entire group of CHROs to talk about, this was back when return to office was still like hot, hot, hot. And one of the biggest challenges was the data piece and getting that translation of whoever it is to define the power dynamic. So if the power dynamic is actually you uncovering what the business truly values and what data supports that, how do you connect those dots to prove the budget is worth spending on contractors, retaining more talent than you were originally scoped out to do, or to be able to add on support systems in a way that helps those managers and other people that are taking on the brunt of that extra work. There's so much hidden between that connection of change, power, and reduction in force. I want to see more work happening there because we all have experienced that throughout our careers. And there is so much more retention value that can happen when we actually have those conversations in earnest.
Absolutely. And it's another vote for just ask the tough questions, or start with asking, right? We've got to raise some of this to the surface to build awareness. We've got to ask the questions because that's how change is really going to happen versus
Absolutely.
perpetuating the status quo. So thank you for that. Felicia, what would progress look like from a data perspective and kind of overall for you?
Yeah, I don't have a full answer to that. I think one idea I've had recently is just, because we work with a lot of companies and thinking about these issues. And with AI powered women, not to get too deeply into what we do, but we have, our academy, our human centered AI leadership certifications. We go into universities and fill that gap before people graduate. And then we work with ERGs and HR leaders and all that stuff to get our programs in. The challenge is when we go in, we have to, we're working with the ERG, we're working with the head of HR. Those tend to be women, led positions, but then they have to convince the, men in power about these issues. And so it's seen as a woman's issue. And so I guess it's kind of convincing men in power. It starts by showing them that what they think is a woman's issue is actually a leadership failure with business consequences. And that's how we have to keep framing it. So yeah, it's data, I guess, but it's also contextualizing the problem and storytelling differently. So I guess that's one piece that we're, grappling with as we kind of think about AI and think about, women falling more and more behind at this drastic rate, and this gap, widening, not just around upskilling, but around leadership involvement and job displacement and all of these things that are affecting women. But there's also this piece around like what leaders can actually do, and I think something they could do is auditing, like audit sponsorship, audit promotion rates, audit who gets AI training first, audit who's doing the invisible labor, audit whether like flexibility is penalized, and then tie manager evaluation to fixing those patterns, because what leaders inspect is what changes. And so I think until we start to really have this done in a more of a metrics based way, it's hard to really tie accountability together. But I mean, rarely you put these issues into the same accountability systems they use for revenue and product delivery or operational risk. So the blind spot is really, to push on this, as many male leaders think they're being objective when they're actually inheriting and preserving biased operating norms. So the way through is not accusation, it's evidence and incentives and design. So I think until we really cross that chasm and that threshold, this is all very muddy and murky and subjective, right? So I guess when you ask that question, that's kind of where my brain goes, is like, we have to have accountability.
Yes, and we have to make it objective, build it into
KPIs.
How performance is being evaluated, how folks are being incentivized, quite frankly. And once it's objective and sort of part of the plan, Nicole, as I think you said, it's workforce transformation. It's critical. It's about a strategic imperative, not how are we fixing this side little issue. Then it gets the airtime that it deserves, and we can measure it, and we can kind of track progress over time. So what a fantastic roundup on that final question. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I did want to just see if there were questions from the group, if anyone wanted to either put questions in the chat for the panel or ask live. Come off mute and ask live. I'm checking the chat as we speak, but if anyone wants to, we'd love to have questions for the panel. Let's see. Some really good commentary in the chat. So thank you everyone for your participation as we had this conversation.
I have a question. Can you hear
Yes.
me? Hi, my name's Marie. This content's been amazing. Thank you so much for everyone's input. I've got lots of notes next to me. I'm not working at the moment. I'm just taking a break due to some burnout. But I'm studying upskilling in AI at the moment, ready for when I return to work. But I'm kind of concerned about the community layer. So I know that we've talked a lot about within businesses here, but I was just wondering from a community person what I could maybe do, or what we could do to help the everyday people that are probably not going to be in these forums, and that their jobs are at risk, etc.
Yes, such a great question. I think anyone on the panel could take this one, but whoever wants to jump in first.
Learn how to build with AI. I think it's one of the most empowering things women can do right now, is learn to build, prototype, figure out how to automate workflows. That's not only going to make you more successful from a getting a job standpoint and make you more valuable in the job market, but it also helps you just redirect your attention to areas where you shine and can put more impact in.
And I'd add, Marie, I'll put some of these resources in the follow-up. So we'll be sending out the recording and a way to reach everyone on the panel. But I'll also just include some resources, some maybe communities that you could look into, both from an AI upskilling perspective, but just generally virtual communities that are helping to surround women in support. So I'll, for everybody, put that in the recap.
That would be amazing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. All right, well, we're at the top of the hour here. So thank you all so much for joining. This was such a great conversation. Thank you to the panel. Happy International Women's Day. And I'm excited to dig into all of these kind of actionable strategies and maybe have a follow-up conversation later this year. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Phil. Bye.
Thank you.